Join me as I challenge myself to spend an entire night in a haunted house, surrounded by portraits that are said to hold the spirits of their subjects. Some people believe that art can carry more than just a visual representation. It can carry stories, emotions, and even spirits. Portraits, in particular, have a unique ability to capture the essence of the subject, preserving their likeness for generations to come. But what if I told you that some of these portraits are said to be haunted? There are many skeptics out there who refuse to believe that art can be haunted, and it's easy to see why. Without concrete evidence, it's difficult to prove that a painting is truly inhabited by a spirit. Many paranormal investigators have attempted to debunk the supernatural claims surrounding haunted portraits, but the legends persist. One of the biggest challenges in proving the existence of haunted portraits is the lack of tangible evidence. We can't exactly take a photograph of a ghost, can we? But that doesn't mean that people haven't reported strange occurrences when it comes to these paintings. From unexplained noises to ghostly apparitions, the stories surrounding haunted portraits are endless. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the concept of haunted portraits continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's because we're drawn to the idea that art can transcend the physical realm, taking on a life of its own. One of the most famous haunted portraits is that of the Anguished Man, a painting that's said to be cursed. The story goes that the artist, Sebastian Borden, used the blood of his deceased father to create the painting, infusing it with a dark and malevolent energy. Many people who have seen the painting have reported feeling an intense sense of dread and fear. Another famous portrait is that of Madame X, a painting by John Singer Sargent that's said to be haunted by the ghost of Virginie Amélie of Agneau-Gautreau. According to legend, Virginie was a beautiful socialite who was known for her scandalous behavior. Her spirit is said to haunt the painting, often manifesting as a faint scent of lavender. The portrait of a young woman by Antonello da Messina is another painting that's said to be haunted. The story goes that the subject of the painting, a young woman, died shortly after the portrait was completed. Her spirit is said to haunt the painting, often causing strange occurrences and unexplained noises. One of the most compelling stories surrounding haunted portraits is that of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. According to legend, the painting is haunted by the ghost of Lady Dorothy Walpole, who died under mysterious circumstances in the 18th century. Many people have reported seeing her ghostly apparition in the painting, often accompanied by a chill in the air. The story of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall is particularly chilling because it's supported by photographic evidence. In 1936, a photographer named Captain Prevand took a photograph of the painting, capturing the ghostly apparition of Lady Dorothy in the process. The photograph has been extensively analyzed, and many experts have concluded that it's impossible to fake. Haunted portraits often blur the line between history and mystery, leaving us to wonder what's real and what's just a product of our imagination. Perhaps it's the combination of art and the supernatural that makes these stories so compelling, allowing us to tap into a deeper sense of reality. Thanks for watching, and if you have any ghost stories of your own, be sure to share them in the comments below. Also, if you want to explore more haunted locations, check out my video on abandoned asylums. Part 1. The Anguish on Canvas. My fascination with haunted portraits began innocently enough, or so I thought. It started in a hushed corner of the university library when I stumbled across an old, dusty tome titled Eternal Echoes, Portraits and the Souls That Linger. The book was filled with strange stories, paintings that held spirits within them, those whose eyes followed you, and ones that whispered or changed shape when no one was watching. Of all the stories I read, one stood out: a portrait painted by Sebastian Borden, an artist known for infusing his work with dark energy. Borden's portrait, The Anguished Man, was infamous, rumored to be painted with his deceased father's blood. People who had encountered it claimed they could feel a distinct malevolence in its presence, an oppressive sense that pressed on them, filling their hearts with dread. Yet, despite the book's warnings, I couldn't shake the story from my mind. Weeks passed, and the thought of the Anguished Man became an obsession. I started searching for any trace of the painting's whereabouts and finally found a lead at a small art gallery just outside of town. They were hosting a private exhibition, and among the pieces was listed, unmistakably, asterisk portrait by Sebastian Borden, asterisk. The gallery was nearly empty the night I visited, just the way I preferred. I wandered through rooms full of vibrant, cheerful pieces, hardly what you'd expect for the eerie reputation surrounding Borden's work. The curator, a stern, thin woman with a gaze as sharp as glass, seemed surprised when I inquired about the anguished man. Few people are interested in that asterisk piece, she said quietly. We keep it in the back, away from the others. I followed her down a dimly lit corridor, each step echoing ominously until she stopped in front of a small, nearly empty room. There it was, hanging under a single, flickering light. The painting was larger than I'd imagined, stretching nearly to the ceiling. The man's face in the portrait was twisted, hollow, and his eyes. There was something in them I couldn't quite place, something tortured, as if he were suffering eternally, trapped within those layers of dried, ancient paint. The eyes seemed to watch me, pleading, almost, and the longer I stared, the more I began to feel a weight in the air, pressing on me, as if the man's despair were bleeding from the canvas into the room around it. Suddenly, the curator's voice snapped me back. I wouldn't stare too long, she warned, her eyes dark. People say it's cursed. You wouldn't want to take that anguish home with you. She gave me a look as if to make sure I understood, but I was already too far gone, enraptured, unable to pull myself away. And in that moment, I made a decision I'd come to regret. I'll buy it, I said, almost breathlessly. The curator didn't argue. Perhaps she was glad to be rid of it. That night, I returned home with the painting carefully wrapped, its dark presence concealed behind layers of cloth. I hung it in my study, against the wall opposite my desk, unable to resist the pull of those hollow eyes as I worked. Days turned into weeks, and I grew accustomed to the painting's watchful gaze, though I began to notice strange happenings around the house. Lights flickered, shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, and the air became thick with an indescribable tension. But the real horror began when I woke one night to the sound of faint, heart-wrenching sobbing. Part 2. Echoes of sorrow. The sobbing was faint at first, like someone trapped far away. My room was pitch dark, shadows seeming to congeal around the corners, thick and unmoving. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound wove its way through the silence, growing louder, turning from a distant cry into something close, too close. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. I lived alone, and though the painting was unnerving, I'd always brushed off the stories of haunted portraits as myths created to boost an artist's legacy. But the soft, tortured sobs continued, filling the room with a sense of dread so powerful I felt it in my bones. I glanced over at the painting, half expecting it to come alive. The man's face stared back, hollow-eyed and twisted in torment. I should have looked away, but my gaze was drawn to his eyes. The longer I stared, the more details I noticed: tiny flecks of red hidden in the darkness of the pupils, as though embers glowed somewhere in the depths of his sorrow. I swear I could see them pulsing, as if they were breathing in unison with me. And then, to my horror, I heard a faint voice. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my heart racing, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind, the result of fatigue, stress. But the voice persisted, murmuring so faintly I had to strain to hear it. "Help me, please." Sleep was out of the question after that. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of those whispered pleas filling the room until dawn. And when the first gray light of morning crept in, the voice faded, leaving me shaken, but wondering if I'd only dreamed the whole thing. That was when I noticed something chilling. There, at the base of the painting, was a single, small, dark stain, a drop of blood. My stomach twisted. Was I losing my mind? Determined to convince myself this was all in my head, I decided to conduct a little experiment. That evening, I set up a camera, pointing directly at the painting, hoping to catch any sign of movement, any hint of what I'd heard the night before. I sat on my couch, watching the time tick by, trying to distract myself, but as the clock crept toward midnight, an unsettling tension grew around me. At exactly 3 a.m., I noticed the faintest of movements. The surface of the painting began to shimmer as though something underneath the paint were writhing, trapped and struggling to emerge. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away, and in that moment, the lights in the room dimmed, casting the entire space in shadows. Then, with a horrible clarity, I saw that the man in the painting shifted. His expression twisted, his mouth slowly curling into an anguished grimace, and he turned his head, just slightly, as though looking right at me. I could feel his gaze pierce through me, his eyes brimming with a raw, haunting misery that seeped into my soul, wrapping around me like a fog. That was when the camera fell, toppled by an unseen force, and a loud scraping echoed through the room. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the wall where the painting hung, as if someone or something was scratching from the inside, desperately clawing to get out. The scratching intensified, each scrape loud and piercing, until I couldn't take it anymore. "Stop it," I shouted, grabbing the painting off the wall in a fit of fear and fury. But the moment I held it in my hands, the scratching stopped, leaving me standing there in silence, the still image of the man's anguished face frozen once more. My relief was short-lived. As I stared into those eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: a faint, shadowy figure in the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, a dark shape, looming just behind the man, like a specter haunting him. Its eyes to pinpricks of light seemed to look past him and straight into me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and then I heard it again, a voice so faint it was barely a whisper. "Help me." It took everything. I had to force myself to let go of the painting, setting it carefully back on the wall. But even after I turned away, I could feel it watching me, the man's anguished eyes following me as I left the room, the whispering echoing faintly in my ears. That night, I locked the door to my study, but I could still hear it, the faint, desperate scratching from within the walls. And as I lay there, heart pounding, the voice grew louder, no longer pleading but screaming in agony. Part 3. The screams beneath the paint. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening to the relentless scratching echo through the house. With every passing hour, it grew louder, more desperate, clawing at my sanity until I was drenched in a cold sweat, gripping my blanket like a lifeline. When morning finally came, I made up my mind. I couldn't bear the painting's presence any longer. I resolved to take it back to the gallery. But as I entered my study, I was met with a terrifying sight. Smeared across the floor, right in front of the painting, were bloody, hand-shaped prints. They led from the base of the painting to the center of the room, then stopped, as if someone had been dragged from that spot. The stains looked fresh, as though whatever or whoever had left them had been here just moments before. My heart hammered in my chest as I carefully approached the painting. The man's expression had changed yet again. This time, his eyes were wider, his mouth open in a silent scream, and the dark figure in the background had shifted forward, looming closer to the foreground, as if it had moved just slightly toward him and maybe toward me, too. Ignoring the nausea that churned in my stomach, I grabbed the painting, barely able to look at the tortured face frozen in agony. I wrapped it in a thick sheet and prepared to take it out to my car, desperate to be rid of it. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice from behind me. It was clear, unmistakable. "Please, don't leave me alone." I froze. The voice didn't sound malevolent. Instead, it was filled with fear so profound, so raw, that I couldn't bring myself to move. A strange feeling washed over me then, something like pity, though I knew I shouldn't be feeling anything like that for a voice coming from within a cursed painting. But the words it spoke next sent an icy chill through my veins. "He's coming back." Before I could react, the sheet around the painting slipped from my hands and fell to the floor, revealing the man's face again. His expression had changed, just slightly, now filled with a strange resignation, and I realized with horror that the shadow behind him had moved even closer, its outstretched hand nearly touching his shoulder. I backed away, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I told myself I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the voices, the bloody handprints, the shifting expressions, none of it could be explained. I needed help. I thought of an old friend, Marie, a historian with a keen interest in the occult. She had mentioned to me once that she'd encountered haunted artifacts in her studies, and though I'd laughed it off at the time, now I was desperate. I called her, stammering out my story, and by the time I finished, she was already on her way. Marie arrived that afternoon, and as she walked into the study, she stopped cold, eyes fixed on the painting. She took a deep, unsteady breath, her face pale. "Do you have any idea what you've brought into your home?" I explained the background as much as I knew, but Marie shook her head, looking unnerved. "There's a reason haunted portraits are considered some of the most dangerous cursed objects," she whispered, barely able to tear her eyes away from the painting. "They're capable of absorbing emotions, capturing energies, even hosting spirits. I've read about Borden's work. He was known for his morbid curiosity, for experimenting with bizarre techniques, even using human blood to imbue his paintings with something extra." "But what about the voices, the blood?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Marie took a hesitant step closer to the painting, examining it with a mixture of dread and fascination. "Portraits like this are said to capture the very essence of the person, their soul. But in this case, I think Borden trapped more than just the subject's essence. He may have summoned something else, something malevolent, and it's feeding on whatever is left of this man's spirit." She touched the frame gingerly, and her eyes widened as she pulled her hand away, clutching it as though she'd been burned. "There's something here," she whispered, barely able to look away. "Something dark. It's like a parasite, and it's using the man in the painting as a vessel. His spirit is bound, forced to endure whatever it is doing to him." Marie turned to me, her voice grave. "The shadow ain't just an entity in the painting. It's a demon, trapped within these layers of paint, bound to the man's spirit as an anchor, and it's growing stronger." We decided to leave the study immediately, planning to consult some of Marie's contacts, people who knew about cursed objects, exorcisms, whatever it took to rid me of this torment. But, as we turned to leave, the door to the study slammed shut, rattling on its hinges. The lights flickered, dimmed, and finally went out, plunging us into darkness. In the silence, I heard it again, the slow, torturous scraping of nails, as if someone were dragging their fingers down the walls. Marie clutched my arm, her breath shallow, and in the darkness, I could see her eyes wide with fear. Then, as we stood frozen, the scraping intensified, growing faster, angrier, until it turned into a frenzied clawing. The walls seemed to vibrate, the air thickening with a foul stench, and then I heard a deep, guttural voice, coming from the direction of the painting. "He belongs to me." A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt the air shift, growing colder as a presence filled the room, looming over us. The voice grew louder, its tone filled with rage and desperation. "You cannot take him." The scratching, the whispers, and the voices grew deafening, surrounding us on all sides. And in the dark, I caught a glimpse of something, a shape, a pair of burning eyes staring at me from the shadows, filled with a hatred so intense I thought it would consume me whole. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a scream that sounded like it came from both the painting and my own throat, merging into a single, agonizing cry. Part 4. Bound by shadows. I awoke sprawled on the cold floor of my study, my head pounding, memories blurred with shadows and half-formed whispers. The room was deathly quiet, and Marie lay nearby, motionless. I crawled to her, relief flooding me as she stirred, her eyes slowly opening. We looked at each other, both of us visibly shaken, each seeing the horror reflected in the other's eyes. "What happened?" she whispered. "I don't know. It's like something knocked us out," I said, my voice trembling as I glanced over at the painting. To our horror, the portrait had changed yet again. The man's face was now gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if drained of life. The shadow figure behind him had moved closer still, almost fully enveloping the man, its arms wrapped around him like a lover, yet its expression was anything but tender. The demon's face was twisted in triumph, its eyes glinting with a cruel light. I realized then that this wasn't just a haunting. This was a slow possession. The shadow in the painting was taking the man's essence piece by piece, feeding on his soul, trapping him in an endless cycle of despair and agony. And somehow, with each feeding, the demon was growing stronger, spreading its influence beyond the confines of the painting. Marie pushed herself up, her face ashen. "This is worse than I thought," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think this poor man is haunting you by choice. He's trapped, enslaved by that demon, and it's using him to get to you." "What do we do?" I asked, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me, thick with the residual energy of the dark presence. "How do we get rid of it?" Marie took a deep breath, visibly shaken. "We have to sever the bond between the man's spirit and the demon. It's the only way to break the curse." She suggested a ritual, something she had learned from a fellow researcher, an invocation intended to free trapped spirits. But there was a risk. If we weren't successful in severing the bond, the demon might grow angry, aggressive, and its influence over the man's spirit could become permanent. There was also the chance that the demon might turn its wrath on us, fully manifesting itself outside the painting. But at that point, the thought of living another night with those voices, those scratching sounds, the dark presence in every shadowed corner, I was willing to try anything. We gathered what we needed for the ritual: candles, chalk for marking a protective circle, and a vial of holy water Marie had brought with her just in case. We dimmed the lights, drawing heavy curtains over the windows to prevent anything from seeing in or, worse, getting out. Marie lit the candles, placing them around the painting, and we began to chant, our voices low and steady as we recited the invocation, calling on any remaining fragment of the man's soul to find peace, to break free from the demonic grasp holding him prisoner. As we chanted, the room grew colder, the shadows stretching, twisting as if alive, the air thickening with a palpable sense of dread. Then, suddenly, a bone-chilling scream filled the room, so loud and piercing that it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I looked at the painting and froze. The man's face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent cry as if he were trapped in the very moment of his soul being ripped away. Marie's voice faltered as we both stared in horror. The shadowy figure in the background was no longer just looming. It had moved to the foreground, fully enveloping the man, its eyes blazing with malevolent fire, a grin stretching across its ghastly face. And then, to our utter horror, it moved. One skeletal, shadowy hand reached out from the painting, stretching beyond the canvas, the long, claw-like fingers curling as they sought us out. I stumbled back, the spell of horror breaking, and grabbed Marie's arm, pulling her away from the advancing shadow. The hand stopped at the edge of the protective circle, clawing at the invisible barrier, leaving deep, black scratches in the air. The demon's face contorted with fury, its mouth opening wide, emitting a guttural growl that reverberated through the room, shaking the walls. The candles flickered wildly, some snuffing out completely, casting the room into near darkness. But in the dim light, I could still see it, the demon's fiery eyes locked onto me, its expression full of hatred and hunger. We had failed. The bond had not been broken. If anything, we had only strengthened it, angering the entity to the point of it almost crossing into our world. "Get out of here," Marie screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. But, as we turned to flee, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping us inside. I turned back, my eyes meeting the demon's blazing stare. It grinned wider, its face contorted in a sickening expression of triumph. And then, it spoke. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its voice a low, venomous hiss that slithered into my ears and took root in my mind. I felt a cold, suffocating presence wrapping around me, seeping into my skin, chilling me to the bone. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt as though I were slipping away, my mind drowning in an endless darkness filled with nothing but the demon's voice and the man's tortured screams. But then, I felt Marie's hand in mine, grounding me, pulling me back from the brink. She was shouting something, her voice barely audible over the demon's laughter. But her words began to break through the fog in my mind. "Fight it," she yelled, her voice desperate, terrified. "Don't let it take you." I fought to regain control, focusing on Marie's voice, clinging to the last shred of my willpower. The demon's grip loosened, its laughter fading as I forced myself back into reality, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet, the warmth of Marie's hand in mine. With one final burst of strength, I stumbled forward, grabbing the holy water from the floor. Ignoring the demon's furious scream, I flung the water at the painting, watching as it hissed and sizzled upon contact, the demon's face contorting in agony. The shadow recoiled, retreating back into the painting, its fiery eyes fading as it was forced back into the depths of the canvas. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the demon's presence receded, leaving us standing in the darkened room, shaken but alive. For a moment, we just stood there, catching our breath, staring at the painting, which now appeared still and lifeless once more. The man's face was blank, his expression one of resignation, as if he had accepted his fate. "We have to destroy it," Marie whispered, her voice trembling. "This painting is a prison, and whatever is in there, it won't stay trapped forever." I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the man's sorrowful gaze. Part 5. The Flames of Release. By the next morning, we'd made up our minds. The painting had to be destroyed. I couldn't risk another night with that thing in my house. Couldn't bear the thought of those tortured screams haunting me in every quiet moment. We decided to burn it. Marie assured me that fire was one of the most effective ways to destroy haunted objects, and if what we'd endured, we weren't taking any chances. We wrapped the painting in an old cloth, careful not to let our skin touch it directly, and carried it to an empty field just outside town. We gathered wood and built a large pyre, stacking it high until the framework seemed ready to incinerate anything, even the malevolent shadow that lay bound within the paint. As we stood there in the chill of the early dawn, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. There was still an ache in my chest, a lingering sense of sorrow that I realized wasn't my own. It was coming from him, the man trapped in the painting. I could feel his misery, his resignation, as if he knew what was about to happen, but had no power to escape it. And yet, there was also a faint glimmer of something else, something that almost felt like hope. We doused the painting with gasoline, stepping back as Marie struck a match, her hand steady, but her face pale. She looked at me, waiting for a nod, a signal that I was ready. With a deep breath, I gave it, and she dropped the match onto the pyre. The flames caught quickly, roaring to life as they devoured the wood and cloth, and finally, the cursed painting itself. For a moment, everything was still, and just the crackling of the fire and the warmth spreading through the cold morning air. I almost dared to hope that it was over, that the nightmare was finally behind us. But then the screaming began. The flames twisted, bending into unnatural shapes, flickering in shades of sickly green and deep crimson. From within the fire, a horrifying, guttural scream echoed, so loud and filled with agony that it reverberated through my very bones. I stumbled back, covering my ears, but the sound pierced through, filling my head with visions of darkness, of a place far removed from any world I'd ever known. The man's face appeared in the flames, twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror as he reached out, as if begging for salvation. Behind him, the shadowy figure loomed, its fiery eyes blazing, mouth open in a triumphant, monstrous grin as it wrapped itself around him, pulling him deeper into the inferno. The man struggled, clawing desperately, his silent pleas breaking my heart even as I knew there was nothing I could do. Marie shouted something, but her words were drowned out by the scream. And then, as we watched in horror, the flames surged, exploding upward in a column of dark smoke that filled the sky, blotting out the morning light. And in the darkness, I saw the demon, its shadowy form towering over us, free from the confines of the painting, its eyes blazing with hatred and hunger as it loomed closer, drawn to us, its former tormentors. I grabbed Marie's arm, dragging her backward, but the demon's presence pressed down on us, filling the air with a suffocating darkness. I could feel its rage, its desire for revenge, seething through the shadows as it closed in, its form shifting and twisting, filling the space around us with a terrible, consuming darkness. Just when I thought it was over, when I felt myself slipping into that endless void, a new sound filled the air, the faint, fragile notes of a melody, soft and haunting, like a lullaby drifting on the wind. I turned, heart pounding, and saw him, the man from the painting, standing on the edge of the flames. He looked different now, no longer twisted in torment, his face calm and resolute. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. With a final, determined look, he stepped forward, reaching out to the demon, his expression fierce and unyielding. The demon recoiled, hissing, its form shrinking as the man's spirit surged forward, his presence filling the air with a light so pure, so powerful, that it pushed back the shadows, forcing the demon to retreat. The man turned to me one last time, his expression softening, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And then, with a final, resolute step, he vanished into the flames, taking the demon with him, the darkness dissipating as the fire finally began to die down. Silence fell, and I stood there, staring at the charred remains of the painting, a profound sense of loss settling over me. The man's spirit was gone, but so was the demon, its curse broken, its darkness finally vanquished. Marie and I stood there for a long time, watching the last embers fade. And in that silence, I felt something shift, a weight lifting from my shoulders, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since I'd first laid eyes on that cursed portrait. We left the field without looking back, the final remnants of the painting smoldering behind us, the nightmare finally over. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint, haunting melody, drifting on the wind like a memory. And in those moments, I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, his spirit finally free, at peace in a way he never was in life. But I also know one thing for certain, I will never look at another portrait the same way again.